Thank you for listening to the Council of Institutional Investors, Voice of Corporate Governance. I'm Jeff Mahoney, General Counsel of CII. The purpose of these monthly episodes is to update CII members and the general public on significant developments in corporate governance and capital markets regulation and CII's related advocacy activities. This update covers a period from June 3rd to June 30th, 2025. The following is my top 10 list of events over that period. Number 10, on June 5th, Judge Reggie B. Walton of the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia ruled that the Securities Exchange Commission's shareholder proposal rules that require longer time periods for holding stock, higher ownership levels, and elevated levels of support for resubmission are valid and should be allowed to stand. The rules were approved by the SEC in September 2020 during the first Trump administration. The final amendments replaced the old ownership threshold, which required holding at least $2,000 or 1% of a company's securities for at least 1 year, with three alternative thresholds that require shareholders to demonstrate continuous ownership of at least $2,000 of the company's securities for at least 3 years, two, $15,000 of the company's securities for at least 2 years, or three, $25,000 of the company's securities for at least 1 year. The SEC also changed the levels of shareholder approval required to resubmit shareholder proposals at the same company's future meeting. Those three new minimum prior support levels to avoid exclusion are: 1, 5% approval for proposals voted on once in the past 5 years; 2, 15% approval for proposals voted on twice in the past 5 years; and 3, 25% approval for those considered 3 or more times in the past 5 years. Those thresholds had been previously 3%, 6%, and 10%, respectively. The rule changes also have 5 additional requirements. 1, they prohibit shareholders from aggregating their holdings to satisfy the new ownership thresholds. 2, they require shareholders who use representatives to file shareholder proposals to provide documentation to clarify that the representatives are authorized to act on their behalf. 3, they require shareholders submitting proposals to indicate that they are able to meet with the companies, either in person or via teleconference, between 10 and 30 days after filing their proposals. 4, they prohibit a shareholder proponent from submitting one proposal in his or her own name and simultaneously serving as a representative to submit a different proposal on another shareholder's behalf for consideration at the same meeting. And 5, they prohibit a representative from submitting more than one proposal to be considered at the same meeting, even if the representative were to submit each proposal on behalf of different shareholders. The Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, As You Sow, and shareholder advocate James McRitchie filed the suit back in June of 2021. Their suit challenged the rules on 3 grounds. 1, that the SEC failed to quantify the benefits of ESG and other shareholder proposals. 2, the SEC placed undue emphasis on the costs of the resolutions for the companies. And 3, the SEC failed to account for a study by its staff that found the rules could reduce the number of resolutions up to 78%. Judge Walton opined that the court must conclude that the commission considered the information available to it and reasonably explained its decision in weighing the cost benefits of its final rule and its impact on shareholder proponents. In response to the ruling, the plaintiffs in the case issued a statement saying, by limiting shareholders' ability to bring important issues to companies and fellow shareholders, the amendments and the decision upholding them will only serve to hurt shareholders and companies alike. The plaintiffs added in their statement that despite this decision, shareholders will continue to engage with corporations on their environmental and social impacts. A spokesperson for plaintiff, the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, said the plaintiffs had not yet decided whether to appeal the decision. U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Financial Services Chair French Hill of Arkansas and Subcommittee on Capital Markets Chair Ann Wagner of Missouri applauded the decision, saying it was a welcome win for common sense and good governance. They pledged that the committees will continue working to streamline the proxy process and reduce burdens for companies seeking to compete in our public markets. Number 9. In testimony delivered June 3rd before the U.S. Senate Appropriations Committee's Subcommittee on Financial Services and General Government, Securities and Exchange Commission Chair Paul Atkins discussed regulations affecting proxy advisors, the proposal to merge the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board into the SEC, and the regulation of cryptocurrency. Committee Chair Bill Hagerty of Tennessee noted that under the chairmanship of Jay Clayton, the SEC amended the definition of solicitation in the proxy rules to include proxy voting advice. By doing that, he said Chair Clayton imposed a baseline level of transparency and accountability on these firms. But he said former Chair Gary Gensler then arbitrarily and capriciously reversed key parts of the rule, allowing Institutional Shareholder Services and Glass Lewis to continue their shakedown of American companies. Chair Hagerty urged the SEC to defend Chair Clayton's rule and explore every possible avenue to rein in proxy advisors. Chair Atkins admitted that he does have concerns about gamesmanship and abuse of the corporate governance process, and he agreed to address those concerns. Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland discussed the problems of the provision in the budget bill that would fold the PCAOB into the SEC. He pointed out that right now the SEC does not have the personnel with the experience needed to conduct in-depth examinations or inspections of registered public accounting firms. Chair Atkins acknowledged this, but said if the PCAOB were incorporated into the SEC and the commission got funding, the SEC could take over that function using the examiners, I would imagine, from the PCAOB and not miss a beat. Senator Van Hollen noted that the PCAOB is funded by assessments paid by the large public companies and fees paid by accounting firms. He explained that funds for the PCAOB would have to come from other sources if it becomes part of the SEC. Chair Atkins said staff departures have left about $100 million in the SEC's coffers that it could use for the PCAOB. Senator Van Hollen replied that the PCAOB's current budget is $400 million, which would mean a $300 million shortfall. Senator Chris Coons of Delaware urged Chair Atkins to prioritize investor protections as the SEC undertakes rulemakings on cryptocurrency. Senator Coons warned that while I recognize the value of making sure the United States is on the cutting edge of innovation in financial services, that has to be balanced with protecting investors and retaining the confidence that global investors have in the credibility of the American capital markets. Chair Atkins said the SEC is tasked with coming up with regulations that make sense for the industry, but also allow for innovation. Chair Atkins also said the Commission's Crypto Task Force is holding roundtables, will be publishing a report in the next couple of months before undertaking a rulemaking process. Number 8, on June 11th, the Delaware Court of Chancery certified 2 questions of law to the Delaware Supreme Court under Article 4, Section 11(8) of the Delaware Constitution, the Delaware Supreme Court Rule 41. Certified questions arise from a May 6, 2025 derivative action filed in the Court of Chancery. That case, Thomas Drew Rutledge versus Clearway Energy Group, challenges Delaware Senate Bill 21, which decreased shareholder rights in mergers and acquisitions that involve a controlling shareholder and curtailed investors' books and records request rights. Plaintiffs in the case assert that the provisions of Senate Bill 21 violate sections of the Delaware Constitution regarding the authority of the Court of Chancery, as well as protections against retroactive decreases in shareholder rights. They seek a ruling that Senate Bill 21 is unconstitutional. Delaware Governor Matt Meyer has intervened to defend the challenge against the law. If successful, the lawsuit could invalidate all or some of Senate Bill 21's provisions. Yours truly traveled to Dover, Delaware twice in March to urge state regulators not to support the Senate Bill 21, raising concerns about both the substance and process of the bill and its impact on shareholder rights. Counsel of Institutional Investors filed testimony. Delaware's House Judiciary Committee on March 19th opposing the bill. March 25th, I responded to questions about potential amendments to the bill posed by a state legislator. In addition, CII sent a joint letter on March 18th with the Managed Funds Association to the chair of Delaware Senate Judiciary Committee, and another letter on March 6th to Delaware Governor Matt Meyer, both letters detailing CII's concerns about the bill. All of the CII letters issued in response to Senate Bill 21 are available to the public on the correspondence page of CII's website. Number 7, on June 17th, Securities and Exchange Commission published a notice that they were withdrawing 14 proposed rules. The only withdrawn proposed rule from the Division of Corporation Finance was a 2022 proposal to amend Rule 14A8, the shareholder proposal rule, by modifying the substantial implementation, duplication, and resubmission basis for exclusion of shareholder proposals. Other withdrawn rules of note include a 2022 proposal require certain registered investment advisors and investment companies to provide additional information regarding their environmental, social, and governance investment practices, and 2022 and 2023 proposals that would have required a number of market participants and actors to develop cybersecurity policies and procedures. The withdrawal means that the SEC will not finalize these rules, and if a future SEC would like to regulate in these areas, will need to publish a new proposed rule with a new public comment period. A future SEC would not be able to use the now withdrawn proposed rules as a basis for a new final rule. Number 6, on June 25th, the U.S. House of Representatives Financial Services Subcommittee on Capital Markets held a hearing entitled Reassessing Sarbanes-Oxley, the Cost of Compliance in Today's Capital Markets. Subcommittee Chair Ann Wagner of Missouri indicated the cost of implementing Section 404B of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, which requires an external audit and attestation of a firm's internal controls over financial reporting, is disproportionately costly for smaller companies. And Chair Wagner indicated that some referred to the Section 404B requirement as a double audit. Chairman French Hill of Arkansas further noted that Sarbanes-Oxley compliance can cost companies more than $1 million a year, calling it the most expensive feature in our public securities rulebook. 3 academics and 1 company executive also weighed in on the cost of Sarbanes-Oxley implementation. Frank Watanabe, president and CEO of Arcutis Biotherapeutics, said Section 404B compliance has cost his company more than $11 million since its IPO in 2020, on par with the cost of running a large clinical trial, while providing minimal information about the company's health and diverting resources from drug development. John Coates of Harvard Law School questioned the prudence of rolling back the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. He testified that Sarbanes-Oxley is a disclosure law in principle and does not impose black and white prescriptive mandates on all U.S. businesses, but rather its disclosures are beneficial to the economy and help deter misconduct by companies. Abigail Allen of Brigham Young University contended that while the benefits of improving financial reporting quality may outweigh the costs, in part by improving firms' access to capital, these benefits are less likely to materialize for smaller and younger firms. Lawrence Cunningham of the University of Delaware's Weinberg Center for Corporate Governance noted that because of Sarbanes-Oxley director workloads and compensation have increased, and audit committees meet twice as frequently, both of which pose disproportionate burdens for smaller companies. Number 5, at a June 25th hearing of the U.S. House of Representatives Judiciary Committee's Subcommittee on the Administrative State, Regulatory Reform, and Antitrust, some lawmakers accused Proxy Advisors Institutional Shareholder Services and Glass Lewis of violating antitrust laws. Subcommittee Chair Scott Fitzgerald of Wisconsin said ISS and Glass Lewis maintain their market power by controlling the systems that investors use to vote. Through their voting platforms, ISS and Glass Lewis make sure most investors never see another proxy advisor's recommendations before casting their votes. Rival proxy advisors cannot access these systems, and public companies cannot responsibly avoid them. Chair Fitzgerald also said, this is the exact kind of gatekeeping that our antitrust laws were written to prevent. Chair Fitzgerald also accused the two proxy advisors of controlling 1/3 of shareholder votes by preloading their voting recommendations into their voting platforms, and a massive number of shareholders vote in lockstep with the duopoly's ideological agenda. Lawmaker explained that he is introducing the Stopping Proxy Advisors Racketeering Act, which would prevent these advisors from offering consulting services. Furthermore, he encouraged the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission to focus their attention and resources on the anti-competitiveness of the two advisory firms. Ranking member of the subcommittee, Jerry Nadler of New York, explained that only a small percentage of the votes that ISS and Glass Lewis issue voting recommendations on address social and environmental issues. Ranking member Nadler said that proxy advisors conduct an independent analysis and offer their best advice to their clients, who are free to make their own independent judgment on how to vote. But the Republicans don't like some of their voting recommendations. As a result, the majority has launched another unfounded antitrust investigation designed purely to intimidate and harass their opponents. Ranking member Nadler added that the investigation is part of the Republicans' goal to entrench corporate interests and conservative political preferences, and it allows them to target and dilute shareholder rights that threaten the interests of their corporate allies. Sean Egan, co-founder and managing partner of Egan Jones, a proxy advisor and credit rating agency that competes with ISS and Glass Lewis, explained how he believes ISS and Glass Lewis use their market dominance to erect barriers to entry by keeping smaller competitors from gaining market share through restraint of trade practices. Egan said both firms offer a lucrative consulting practice, offering companies the opportunity to improve their corporate governance scores, manage executive compensation decisions, and strengthen ESG ratings. Egan also accused ISS of providing a voting platform that is used by the bulk of institutional investors, and that excludes Egan Jones voting recommendations and does not show public information from third parties, such as voting deadlines. Egan said competition is restricted if managers cannot access the work product of competing proxy advisors, and serves to restrict competition. Now, Minnow, vice chair of Value Edge Advisors, said, "I don't understand why Mr. Egan thinks he has a right to the voting platform that ISS built with their time, energy, and expertise." Minnow added, "If he wants to compete with that, let him build his own and make it better." Minnow also told the subcommittee that if ISS and Glass Lewis are too powerful, corporate America should be popping champagne corks, because the firms recommend with management 96% of the time. She informed all lawmakers that there are new entrants to the proxy advisory market all the time, and she uses a new one that is free. Minnow asserted the real problem is with companies. Public companies are currently devoting enormous amounts of money, effort, and creativity to come up with ways to cut off shareholder oversight, including restricting the sole sources of independent research on matters presented to them for their approval. Minnow concluded her remarks by strongly arguing the subcommittee to allow the free market to operate. Charles Crane, managing vice president of policy for the National Association of Manufacturers, accused ISS and Glass Lewis of using their dominant market positions, namely their one-size-fits-all policies and their robo-voting platforms, to exercise undue influence over proxy voting outcomes, consolidate power, and drive revenue toward their consulting services. Crane said it would be costly and difficult for a startup to replicate the back-office proxy vote instruction delivery services that the two major firms have established over the past 2 decades. Crane said the convoluted U.S. proxy voting system and the various intermediaries that stand between companies and the retail investors add to the barriers to entry for startups. He urged Congress to pass legislation to regulate proxy advisors. Caleb Griffin, associate professor of law at the University of North Carolina School of Law, said ISS and Glass Lewis significantly limit the range of governance opinions available to investors. He also accused them of generating systemic biases or amplifying inaccuracies, reducing incentives for experimentation and innovation, and potentially generating an entrenched and artificially narrow set of governance standards. Griffith said the advisors, by both advising clients on what constitutes good governance and deciding what constitutes good governance, generates an important structural conflict. Griffin said as a result, such conflicts or potential conflicts represent an important area for legislative and regulatory consideration. Number 4, at its June 5th meeting, the Securities and Exchange Commission's Investor Advisory Committee discussed pass-through voting and other means of reaching beneficial owners, in addition to market perspectives on non-GAAP financial disclosures. During the panel on pass-through voting, John Galloway, Global Head of Investment Stewardship for Vanguard, explained Investor Choice, the pass-through voting system that Vanguard launched for retail investors in 2023. Will Goodwin, co-founder and head of U.S. sales for Tumelo, said his company provides a platform on which institutional investors can select their voting policy, see upcoming votes, cast their votes, and disclose information about how they have cast their ballots. Paul Washington, president and CEO of the Society for Corporate Governance, said while he supports the idea of expanding voting choices for all investors, he has concerns about pass-through voting. He said he's worried that this new voting arrangement could hinder the current engagement process, allows the largest institutional investors to meet with corporate management and have nuanced, in-depth discussions that benefit both parties. Joe Fish, a Fox Distinguished Professor of Business Law at the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School, outlined difficulties that retail investors encounter when trying to engage in corporate governance and vote their proxies. She suggested that instead of instituting pass-through voting, the SEC promote informed intermediation through which retail investors could inform their funds of their voting preferences. During the panel on non-GAAP financial disclosures, yours truly stated that the Counsel of Institutional Investors believe deviations from GAAP need to be clear and put in context through disclosure of a quantitative reconciliation of GAAP to non-GAAP for executive compensation performance targets. I also noted that a quantitative reconciliation for non-GAAP executive compensation targets is especially important because the disclosures in the compensation discussion and analysis section of the proxy statement are used by many investors when evaluating executive compensation for voting on say-on-pay. In addition, I noted the compensation discussion and analysis section conveys information about a corporation's governance more generally, which can inform investors in deciding how to vote on the election or re-election of directors, including the chairs and members of the audit, compensation, and governance committees. I also noted that in 2019, CII filed a rulemaking petition to the SEC to address this issue, and I expressed optimism that the Investor Advisory Committee, working with the SEC, could eliminate this long-standing loophole in the SEC's requirements related to non-GAAP disclosures. Number 3, on June 16th, the Counsel of Institutional Investors staff posted a handout requested by a U.S. Senate staffer that illustrates the requirements of a disclosure required by a bipartisan bill on dual-class stock disclosure. The one-page CII explainer of H.R. 3357, the Enhancing Multi-Class Disclosures Act, is available for policymakers, press, and market participants' reference. The bill, sponsored by Representative Gregory Meeks of New York, passed a U.S. House Committee on Financial Services markup on May 18th. A floor vote on the bill is expected in the full House later this year. CI supports the bill, which would clarify gaps between stock ownership and voting power, while acknowledging that future legislation or rulemaking to bring transparency to voting results on a class-by-class basis consistent with CII membership group policies, also remains a CII advocacy priority. Number 2, on June 26th, the Counsel of Institutional Investors Executive Director Bob McCormick and several CII members shared their insights during a Securities and Exchange Commission roundtable on executive compensation disclosure requirements. McCormick said some of the complexities of executive compensation disclosure are the result of information that is being provided because it is important to a subset of investors. Overall, he said a good rule of thumb for compensation disclosure is don't let what is required get in the way of what is helpful. He also explained that proxy advisors' voting recommendations and guidelines concerning executive compensation are ultimately driven by investor preferences. In addition to his comments during the roundtable discussion, McCormick submitted a comment letter on June 25th sharing CII's perspective on the overall importance of executive compensation disclosures to institutional investors, as well as CII's perspective on key elements of the disclosure process and requirements that should remain in place or be expanded. Ola Peter Krohn Yessing, lead investment stewardship manager for Norges Bank Investment Management, emphasized that current disclosure makes it impossible to track the life cycle of outstanding equity awards. While acknowledging that proxy advisor firms are necessary and useful to Norges, he said he disagrees with their policies, which he believes favor complex performance share units. Krohn-Yessing advocated for simpler pay in the form of restricted shares with a lock-in period that reflects a reasonable amount of time in a company's business cycle. Brandon Rees, Deputy Director of Corporations and Capital Markets for the AFL-CIO, said the problem with executive compensation is not too much disclosure, but that executive compensation plans are too elaborate. He also urged the SEC to make the information disclosed in the summary compensation table and elsewhere in proxy statements uniform and machine readable. He explained that if the commission did this, investors could conduct their own pay analysis instead of relying on proxy advisors. Michael McCauley, Senior Officer of Investment Programs and Governance for the State Board of Administration of Florida and a CII board member and co-chair, suggested that SEC rules should require a clear connection between pay and performance with a graph outlining relative pay for relative performance and granular information on targets, thresholds, performance objectives, and the rationale for awards. McCauley also recommended the SEC require companies to expand disclosure for named executive officers beyond 5, especially at companies with more complex management structures. John Rowe, head of investment stewardship in the Americas for BlackRock, said currently no single table provides information about how compensation is structured in terms of long-term and short-term incentives, equity and cash compensation, and performance-based and time-based awards. In addition, information about whether executive pay is achieving what it is intended is too difficult to decipher. Drew Hambley, Investment Director of Stewardship for California Public Employees Retirement System and a CII board member, pointed to the many redundancies in proxy statements. He asserted, nothing in the compensation rule says that we need to set up complex, opaque rules. He agreed with Krohn-Yessing that information about equity awards needs to be communicated more effectively. Hambley supported the pay ratio disclosure rules because he said they make companies think about their lower wage workers who are generally the face of the companies. Finally, Hambley cautioned the SEC about lifting executive compensation disclosure requirements. He warned, let's be careful we don't do away with the tools we need to hold people accountable. And my number one most significant development in U.S. corporate governance, capital markets regulation for the period from June 3rd to June 30th, occurred on June 19th, when the U.S. Senate parliamentarian ruled that a legislative proposal to fold the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board into the Securities Exchange Commission could be removed from the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Bill because it proposes a policy change rather than a budget change in violation of the Byrd Rule. The move means that 60 senators would need to vote to waive the rule to keep the provision in the bill, or Republicans would have to alter the provision so that it would comply with the Byrd Rule. As of the date of this podcast, neither option appears likely. PCAOB Chair Erica Williams said in a statement, "This is good news for millions of Americans whose retirement savings and investments would be put at risk by eliminating the PCAOB." Over the past month, the Council of Institutional Investors repeatedly publicly opposed the budget reconciliation provision, including in a June 5th letter, the U.S. Senate leadership urging them to oppose the provision. Correspondents pointed to CII's membership-approved policies that stated these 3 principles that are in conflict with the provision. 1, auditors should be subject to robust oversight, genuine accountability. 2, Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, which created the PCAOB, bolstered the oversight and accountability of accounting firms. And 3, the responsibility to promulgate auditing standards should reside with independent organizations with sufficient resources and accountability to investors. CII letter also noted that from 2006 to 2010, CII led an investor effort that successfully defended efforts to abolish the PCAOB on constitutional grounds. The provisions of the budget bill would have eliminated both, 1, the PCAOB's status as a private sector non-governmental body separate from the SEC, and 2, the PCAOB's stable independent funding. Those 2 factors, if eliminated, would likely result in weaker oversight of auditing firms, and reduced accuracy and reliability of financial reporting. CII's letter also detailed how the SEC does not have the current human resources, expertise, or the funding to assume the responsibilities of the PCAOB. The letter also warned that having the PCAOB absorbed into the SEC would also likely result in the termination of PCAOB inspections of registered auditing firms in China. Inspections required by the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002 and long publicly supported by CII. Although the provision transferring the PCAOB to the SEC is being proposed as a means of reducing government spending, the PCAOB is actually funded through assessments paid by the largest public companies and by fees paid by accounting firms. And as a result, without that independent funding source, Congress would have to significantly increase appropriations to the SEC immediately and on an annual ongoing basis to pay for the costs of audit oversight. That completes my monthly U.S. corporate governance and capital markets update. If you have any questions regarding any of the issues discussed, please feel free to email me at Jeff, that's Jeff, at CII.org. Until next time, I'm Jeff Mahoney. Thanks again for listening to the voice of corporate governance.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Voice of Corporate Governance, brought to you by the Council of Institutional Investors. The Voice of Corporate Governance is a free, non-sponsored podcast that highlights critical developments in corporate governance and other important issues affecting institutional investors. The views expressed by those interviewed on the podcast do not necessarily reflect the views of CII or its members. For more information on CII and its policies on corporate governance, please visit our website at www.cii.org.